They were outlaws, all but forgotten.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were lost to history. The movie put them on the map.
Wild Western bandits at the end of an era.
It's timeless. It's a piece of history. There is a kind of romantic aspect, a sort of a Robin Hood-like feeling about them.
But a film would bring them back to life and into the hearts of audiences.
I think it's one of those magical stories. It happened to be beautifully done. It was wonderfully directed and shot and acted.
What appeals to me is the fact that they're kind of anti-hero.
A timeless story of friendship, the Old West, and two American outlaws out of time. When it premiered in 1969, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid asked audiences to embrace two bickering outlaws as heroes.
Ready? No, we'll jump. We got to.
Up. Get away from me.
Why?
I want to fight them.
They'll kill us.
Maybe.
You want to die?
Do you?
All right. I'll jump first.
No.
Then you jump first.
No, I said.
What's the matter with you?
I can't swim.
Why, are you crazy? The fall will probably kill you.
The big moment in my movie career was the jump off the cliff scene, because 30 years ago, that was a showstopper. In movie theaters at that time, they literally screamed and clapped and roared with laughter. And what that meant to me was they were with them no matter where they went.
Rarely before in motion picture history had an audience been openly rooting for the bad guys to get away, violating the most basic tradition of the classic Western. Good triumphs over evil. The hero gets the girl, and in the final reel, justice is served. But in the late 1960s, a new mythology was taking shape across the land, as movies like Bonnie and Clyde re-examined who the heroes and the villains really were. Into this changing climate came the tale of two outlaws who rode together during the twilight years of the Wild West. For close to a decade, novelist William Goldman had been digging through the stories about famous gunslingers like Jesse James and the notorious gangs like the Wild Bunch. He discovered the story of Butch and Sundance in the pages of Western pulps and comic books.
I researched it from 57 till 65. And whatever I could find, you squirreled out of libraries and stuff. One of the sadnesses about our West, the Wild West is a very short period. It runs from the end of the Civil War to 1900. Cassidy was the end of it. And we don't have great historians. It was just a wild area. And we don't really know a lot of what happened.
The story of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid included the usual Western conventions of train robberies and bank holdups. But the one fact which hooked Goldman was that Butch and Sundance chose to leave the West, a frontier that was shrinking under the onslaught of modern technology.
I remember thinking what a wonderful story it was because they did it twice. That was what appealed to me, basically, that they went to South America and were legends all over again.
By making decisions based on his feelings rather than facts, Goldman decided to tell the tale of two charming rogues. And eventually, the story became a matter of the heart.
Look, it's as if I knew what I was doing. The fact is, I had no idea. I was trying to tell this story that moved me. I was trying to do it in a form I had no experience in. I had never seen a screenplay at this point. I'd never written a movie. And all I had was my love of the two guys. and the nuttiness of what they did.
Goldman's unique story about two anti-heroes fighting back against faceless authority captured the spirit of the 1960s.
Who are those guys?
At its core, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was a buddy movie that worked in part because of the chemistry of its stars. In hindsight, it's almost impossible to imagine anyone but Paul Newman playing Butch and Robert Redford playing Sundance. But at the time, the legendary Outlaws took on all shapes and sizes.
I remember I wrote it for Paul Newman and for Jack Lemmon. Paul Newman as the Sundance Kid and Jack Lemmon as Butch Cassidy.
The script for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid called for two star parts. This intrigued Richard Zanuck, production chief of 20th Century Fox.
I had learned that Newman and Steve McQueen were very interested in this. So I bought it, sight unseen, paid the most that had ever been paid for an original screenplay at the time. And it was $400,000, which was a huge figure.
Zanuck then went after director George Roy Hill, who had demonstrated a light comedic touch with films like Thoroughly Modern Millie, and was known as an actor's director.
Actors have great confidence in him because he's got a great eye for detail, he's got a great eye for performance.
But even the addition of Hill couldn't hold the project together.
For quite a while, Paul Newman and Steve McQueen were the two stars of that picture, but it fell apart after a tremendous amount of meetings and discussions and back and forth on billing. And they both thought that they should be in first position. And I gave them demonstrations of turning wheels. I gave them ways of how we could split the country, and I had a map formed where, you know, half of the country would be Paul Newman, half of the country would be Steve McQueen. The world was split in half. I had all of these displays and everything. And finally, Steve dropped out. And then a whole slew of names came to us. Warren Beatty started calling. Marlon Brando was considered. The one person who George Roy Hill and Paul really wanted desperately was Bob Redford. I never saw it until the first day's dailies. I said, I admit completely, you were right all along. Why did we waste all this time?
In the late 1960s, Robert Redford was a relative newcomer, best known for his comic turn in the movie Barefoot in the Park.
Paul, if the honeymoon doesn't work out, let's not get divorced. Let's kill each other.
Let's have one of the maids do it. I hear the service here is wonderful.
It's the Wake Up, Break the Rules, Rock the Boat, Live It Up Comedy of the Year. Why don't you fall over laughing and go barefoot in the park?
Paul, it was my understanding at the time that he couldn't make up his mind which part to play. And the original title of the piece was The Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy. So he was going to play the Sundance Kid. For me, I was only interested in one part, and that was Sundance. That was a part that I felt a particular connection for.
Well, looks like you just about cleaned everybody out, fella. You haven't lost a hand since you got the deal. What's the secret of your success?
Prayer.
One of the things that happened was Redford was sensational. It's arguably the best thing he ever did on film. And John Foreman, Paul's producer, went to Paul and said, he's getting too many close-ups. I'm going to end that. Newman said, don't do anything. Don't do anything. Because Newman, the difference between Newman and McQueen, who are great stars parallel, Newman always wanted talent around him because he felt it made him look better.
Under the direction of George Roy Hill, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid began shooting on a vintage railroad that ran between Durango and Silverton, Colorado on September 16, 1968.
We had to shoot the movie when we shot it Because at that time, the train that they keep robbing, I believe the same train redressed, was the only period train in the country that worked. And we could get it, I think, for a week or 2 weeks at a certain time when it was laid off, and that's when we had to shoot.
The first scene that was shot was based on an actual holdup of a Union Pacific train near Wilcox, Wyoming, on June 2nd, 1899.
Hold it there.
I just thought I'd watch.
Bring the kids, why don't you?
The robbery marked the first time in history that the real Butch and Sundance worked together. It also marked the beginning of a feud between the outlaws and railroad tycoon E.H. Harriman.
You're just gonna get yourself blown up. You don't open that door.
I can't do that. On account of I work for Mr. E.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific Railroad. He entrusted
Will you
me...
shut up about that E.H. Harriman stuff and open the door?
What's going on?
You got a patriot in there. Okay, go ahead, News.
That's young Woodcock. He's awful dedicated.
Woodcock?
Yes, sir?
You know who we are.
You're the hole-in-the-wall gang, Mr. Cassidy. I understand that. But you got to understand Mr. E.H. Harriman himself of the Union Pacific Railroad give me this job. And I got to do my best, don't you see?
Your best don't include getting yourself killed.
Dynamite's ready, Butch.
Mr. E.H. Harriman himself, he had the confidence of me.
Open the door or that's it. Do you think E.H. Harriman would get himself killed for you? Woodcock?
I work for Mr. E.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific Railroad. And he entrusted me.
Hey, Woodcock. Hey, Woodcock, you all right? Hey. Oh. Whatever Harriman's paying you ain't enough.
The delicate balance between comedy and a believable Western was also a daily struggle for director George Roy Hill and actor Paul Newman.
George says something has happened between rehearsal and shooting, and what you're doing now is not what you were doing when we came here. You're trying to be funny, and you weren't doing that in rehearsal. So that shows you what happens when you get in front of a camera.
Hill also encouraged his collaborators, like director of photography Conrad Hall, to search for ways to capture his overall theme of the encroaching modern age and its impact on Butch and Sundance.
The spirit of the piece is truthful and intact, and for me, it was at a time when corporations and were downsizing and people were being put out of work. Here was a metaphor of the past for the future. Butch and Sundance being put out of business and being unable to find a new way into the future.
Future's all yours, you lousy bicycles.
And that was a great metaphor for the 20th century and gave me many clues about what to do with the film and how to see it visually.
Many of the great Hollywood westerns had traditionally been shot in the rugged country where the desert meets the Rockies. But Connie Hall wanted to create a new look for the film.
We were so lucky. Connie happens to be, for me, the greatest outdoor cinematographer that ever lived. I mean, the look of the movie, you think that's easy? Come on, that's wonderful. We were very lucky. Another cameraman might have given us other stuff, but not that. I remember I went out to see the first 4 hours of dailies. And I remember there's a shot when they're being chased and they're riding. And they go down, and then they come up. And I thought, oh my God, it looks so great. And I just screamed when I was alone. I thought, wow.
As shooting continued in locations where the real-life outlaws once roamed, it was probably inevitable that the film would come face-to-face with history. Like the day when 84-year-old Lula Parker Bettinson, Butch Cassidy's last surviving sibling, came to visit the set near St. George, Utah.
She was very vivacious and talkative, and it was especially rewarding to meet somebody that was alive still, that was connected to the real people. It gave us a historical reality to the film that we were making.
The filmmakers were telling the tale of famous outlaws. But the legend of Butch and Sundance began as the true story of two poor farm boys named Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Alonzo Longabaugh.
Hole in the Wall gang, I guess you've all heard it, just robbed the flyer right outside of our town. So that makes it our responsibility to get out there and get after them. Now, you're going to have to bring your own horses. How many of you can bring your own guns? Yeah, well, how many of you are going to want me to supply you with guns? Bill, come on now. I think it's up to us to do something, don't you?
What's the point? They're probably halfway to Hole in the Wall already.
Now, that's just exactly why we have got to hurry. If we get mounted up right now and get on out there after them, maybe we can head them off.
Head them off? You crazy? We did that.
Capturing the spirit of the unique friendship shared by the two outlaws was critical to the success of the film.
Boy, I just beat this up with a spoon.
Well, they knew nothing about each other. That was an assumption I made. I don't think they did. You know, I mean, I just decided it was a wonderful vehicle. I mean, they traveled so long together, and they traveled so far, and I made the decision, which I believe is true, since I don't think either one of them were like going to say, let me tell you about my childhood. I had a really rotten daddy. I don't think they did that. I just think they went along and tried to stay alive. And I thought, I think it's moving.
Why don't we enlist? Go fight the Spanish, you and me in the war.
We got a lot of things going for us. Experience, maturity, leadership. I bet we end up officers. That'd be Major Parker. Parker? Yeah, that's my real name. Robert Leroy Parker. No fooling?
Robert Leroy Parker was born in Beaver, Utah on April 13, 1866. His father, Maximilian, scratched out a living ranching and was often absent. His mother, Ann Gillies, helped work the land on a neighbor's ranch, as did Robert.
They had to work at this neighbor ranch because they were just not making it on their own farm. His father had to hire out and work out away from the family, and his mother had to go to this ranch, and Butch went there.
Temperatures 100 degrees plus in July and freezing and snow in the wintertime. I think any young kid would say, there's got to be something better than this. I've got to find it. Unfortunately, the move that he made was to follow one of the ranch hands, who was a fellow by the name of Mike Cassidy, who moonlighted as, well, they called it moving a few strays. Some people might call it rustling. It was moving a few strays in those days.
Robert Parker eventually acquired the name Cassidy as an alias and the nickname Butch while working as a butcher. In June 1889, Butch graduated from small-time rustling when he and two accomplices rode into Telluride, Colorado, and robbed the local bank of $10,500. Butch was recognized during the escape and became a known outlaw. In this rarely seen interview, Butch's sister Lula recalled the pain he caused his close-knit Mormon family.
It hurt my folks terribly for him to be doing the things he done. They weren't that kind of people, and they were heartbroken. In fact, he broke my mother's heart.
Mine's Longbaugh. No fool. Long what? Terry Longbaugh. So you'd be Major Longbaugh. What do you say?
Harry Alonzo Longabaugh also endured poverty and an absentee father. He was born April 19th, 1867, in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania.
Sundance was born into a large family. He had several brothers and sisters, and they were very poor. They were owned any real estate, and when we checked the records where they lived, they would move like every 3 or 4 months. And he always Sundance's father at one time was a canal man, then he was a farmer, and then he was a carpenter. He just worked at different jobs, and it was kind of like a dysfunctional family.
Harry's father, Josiah, drifted between farming, carpentry, and canal work. His mother, Annie Place, struggled unsuccessfully to keep her family together.
I think Sundance was only around 12 years old, and we find him in the census in 1880, living about 20 miles away from home, working on the ranch as a farmhand.
By the age of 14, Harry had joined his cousin George's family in Illinois. They headed west and settled on a homestead outside of Cortez, Colorado.
There's evidence of what we have heard from George's family, George Longabaugh, out in Cortez, Colorado, that the McCartys and Butch and Burt Madden and several other ones that are associated with the Wild Bunch would pass through there. And they would were into horse racing and gambling, and they would just stop at the ranch and just pass through mostly.
Harry Longabaugh's life of crime began in 1887, when the 20-year-old was laid off from his job as a ranch hand at the Double N Ranch in Montana. On February 27th, he stole a horse, gun, and saddle from a Triple V Ranch employee. He was arrested 4 months later and jailed in Sundance, Wyoming.
I think even though he stopped his formal schooling around 13 when he went out west, he obviously had an ability to write letters. If you would look in the letter that he wrote when he was in jail about what he did wrong, and he was willing to pay the price. He was kind of a self-taught, self-educated person.
Harry was pardoned by Governor Thomas Moonlight on February 4th, 1889. Released from jail in Sundance, Wyoming, Harry had a new nickname and little else as he headed into Canada and took a job breaking horses for the Bar U Ranch. He later became a partner in the Grand Central Saloon in Calgary. It would be years before the Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy teamed up together as outlaws, and there would be strange twists and turns in the tale of their journey into a life of crime. In 1889, just months after his first bank robbery, Butch moved to Wyoming and attempted to go straight when he bought a homestead ranch. He settled down to a life of working cattle, some of which were even his.
There's 2 buildings in North America that still exist that Butch Cassidy built. Both of them were in Hole in the Wall in Wyoming because Butch Cassidy, in about 1891, bought a homestead there, and he probably used the loot from the Telluride robbery of 1889 to purchase this ranch. And the thing that made them so interesting to me was that one cabin looked like a normal cabin. It had doors, windows, it had a place for a fireplace and so on. The other cabin, though, was the one that he lived in. That one had a door and not a single window. The reason that he lived in that kind of a cabin was that it was much easier to defend the door opening than it would have been if he'd had to deal with windows all around. One thing Hollywood has done that maybe hasn't helped our view of what life was like in the West is they've made it look fairly glamorous. And when you looked at that movie, you saw them in a bordello in a town. You saw them drinking. Then they were out in this cabin, and I mean, there was nice furniture and everything looks great. But if you look at the few memoirs that we have of these outlaws, they don't talk about nice pillows and tablecloths on the table. And in fact, they do a lot of talking about food. Amazingly, all the way through their memoirs, they talk about food, because the one thing that they had that concerned them as much as getting away from the law was what they were going to eat. And water was a very important aspect for them. It was nothing for them to have to ride at least 100 miles a day, maybe longer. Their horses needed fodder and water. So these are the kind of things that concern them. And it doesn't make very good for movies. It's not very exciting, but it's the way they lived, which was on the edge and experiencing a great deal of privation.
One of the reasons Butch lived the way he did was because his homestead was located along what became known as the Outlaw Trail. This was not so much a trail as a series of isolated ranches. Many of the outlaws worked on these spreads between robberies. They knew the backcountry shortcuts and secrets.
The trail goes through the three major hideouts, goes through Hole in the Wall in the center of Wyoming, through Brown's Hole where the three states come together, and through Robber's Roost down to the south. The trail provided a route for these people to get from one place to another.
Butch might have lived out his days near Hole in the Wall as a small-time rustler, but battle lines were being drawn between the small ranchers and the big cattle companies that were taking over the West.
The whole area had probably 2 million cattle or so in it, and about 3% of those you could count on these people rustling in a given year. They said, well, 3%, that's really not a big deal, but that's 60,000 cows. And you spread that out over all this big acreage, that's a lot happening. As a result of this, we got into what became known as the Johnson County Cattle War in Johnson County, Wyoming, where the nesters were actually taking apart some of these herds, mainly to stay alive. I mean, they didn't have anything to eat in some cases, so you can sort of make a case in both ways. But the big cattle companies obviously didn't go for this, and their position was that they settled the West. They were the people that had to fight Indian tribes out there, and they went through all these difficulties. Now, these people are making life very difficult for them. So they hired 50 gunmen from Texas, all top gunmen, and they made up a death list. And they had a list of 125 people that they were actually going to kill.
One of those citizens would have been Butch Cassidy. He was a rustler. That's what he did in Hole in the Wall. And that's why he was so afraid of the ranchers. In the fall of 1891, he sold the ranch on the run and got out of there before he was the target of the cattlemen.
Butch's career as a small-time thief came to a close in July of 1894 when he was convicted of stealing a horse and sentenced to 2 years in Wyoming State Penitentiary in Laramie. Stories from this time testified to the emergence of an extraordinary man.
About a year ago, some documents came to light in Wyoming where the prosecuting attorney who put Butch Cassidy in jail for horse theft organized a petition of his friends and neighbors and lawyers and substantial citizens in the area petitioning the governor to get Butch Cassidy released from jail. I mean, this is just an amazing example of how well-liked he was and what people thought of him.
Good night, Sam. Good night. What happened to the old bank? It was beautiful. People kept robbing it. It's a small price to pay for beauty.
This was, for me, the greatest character introduction still to this day I've ever known. Cassidy is in jail. The warden calls him in and says, I'll make you a deal. I'll set you free if you promise to go straight. That's the greatest deal you ever heard of. And Cassidy said, I can't do that, but I'll make you a deal. I promise I'll never do anything in this state again.
Well, we seem to be a little short on brotherly love around here.
If you're with him, you better get yourselves out of here.
We're on our way.
I wasn't cheating. I wasn't cheating. You can die. For that matter, you can both die.
You hear that?
If he invites us to stay, then we'll go.
We're going to leave anyway.
He's got to invite us to stick around.
He'll draw on you. He's ready. You don't know how fast he is. I'm over the hill, but it can't happen to you.
And that's just what I want to hear.
Every day you get older. Now, that's a law.
Goldman retained and enhanced the likable image of Butch from the very beginning of the film. But in real life, the prison experience may have hardened Butch. Released in January of 1896, by August he had returned to his outlaw ways. He took part in a bank robbery in Mount Pelier, Idaho. The legend of the most unique outlaw the West has ever known began to grow.
One of the people that I think really brought things alive to me was the mother of the Ecker boys in southeastern Utah, whose name was Edna Gibbons. Her father, Charlie Gibbons, ran a general store in the little village of Hanksville. Hanksville was the nearest place to Robber's Roost hideout.
Can you tell us a little bit about
Butch was a wonderful man. When we see them ride in, there's never less than 9 to 12 men on all armed to the teeth. He would take us up on his shoulders and give us a piggyback ride or a wheelbarrow ride, and spent most of the time hollers getting their horses fed, playing with us.
She'd talk about playing jacks with him. He used $20 gold pieces for jacks that were probably lifted from somewhere, and she said he always collected them all afterwards. She said, but when he left after the last meal that he'd have there, after he'd stayed a couple of days, they'd always find a $20 gold piece under his plate at the table.
The gangs that Butch led respected both a way of life and the value of life.
They didn't shoot up towns. They didn't kill people when they committed holdups. They were also part of the small rancher versus big rancher environment of the Rocky Mountain West, and the cowboy versus the railroad. And all of these things helped make them part of, representative of the small communities, the small ranchers, and made them loved by a lot of people in the West.
One of the people who grew up in the hideout known as Robber's Roost was Pearl Baker. She understood the reason that ordinary folks would risk hiding known outlaws.
But in the day that they rode, they were not looked upon as murderers and outlaws. They were looked upon as men who were free, more or less.
The West was changing. It was settling up with people. I don't think they felt maybe they could trust these newcomers as much as they did the old farmers and ranchers. It was getting harder and harder to pull train robberies and bank robberies and get away. For one thing, it's awful hard for a horse to run through a fence. And farmers and ranchers were fencing the West. When you had these fast getaways, it was no longer the open range that you could ride through. Also, the first automobiles were beginning to make their appearance in the West. The telegraph, of course, was always in the West, but the telephone came into use, and that was an even better tool for law enforcement.
Freedom in the West was beginning to mean something else. The freedom of big business to fence the land, and the freedom of iron horses to rule it. Against the inevitable, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid would strike back in the only way they knew how, as outlaws.
What would you think about maybe asking us to stick around?
What?
You don't have to mean it or anything. Just ask us to stick around, I promise you. I can't help you, Sundance.
I didn't know you were the Sundance Kid when I said you were cheating. If I draw on you, you'll kill me. There's that possibility.
No, you'd be killing yourself. So why don't you just invite us to stick around? You can do it. I mean, easy. Come on. Come on.
I just stick around.
Thanks, but we gotta get going.
Hey, kid. Hey, kid. How good are you?
In what many think of as typical Hollywood liberties, Sundance was portrayed in the film as an incredible gunslinger. Yet even the scant historical evidence that survives supports his reputation.
In the movie, Sundance was supposed to be a very fast gunslinger, and I think that he probably was. Everything that we've ever researched said that he was probably as fast as a snake's tongue.
Memories of relatives indicate the trait might run in the descendants of Sundance.
My uncle joined the Navy, and one of the things they had to do in the Navy was to learn to shoot a pistol. And he said immediately when he grabbed that pistol that first day, he was the best one in his class and got the highest marks.
In the film, the real Butch and Sundance rode with a loose confederation of outlaws called the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, perhaps better known as the Wild Bunch.
Hi, News, what you doing?
Oh, howdy, Butch. Nothing? Nothing? Howdy, Sundance.
Well, you sure are. You're doing something. What?
Just fixed and robbed Union Pacific flyer, Butch. That's all we had in mind.
You fellas got everything I told you all wrong.
That's an interesting scene because they let us into three real characters in the Wild Bunch. Harvey Logan, even though we don't see him again, it's acknowledged he's there. News Carver, who was really Will Carver, and he wasn't News Carver and didn't collect newspapers. And, of course, Flat-Nosed George Curry. He's only addressed in one line by Butch Cassidy, and he was much bigger than that in the entire story of the Wild Bunch.
Okay, so we just forget about Logan taking over, okay, Flatnose?
Well, you always said that any one of us could challenge you, Butch.
Well, that's because I figured no one would do it.
Guns or knives?
Neither?
Pick.
I don't want to shoot with you, Harvey.
Anything you say, Butch. Sundance? When we're done, if he's dead, you're welcome to stay.
Listen, I don't mean to be a sore loser, but when it's done, if I'm dead, kill him.
Love to.
No, not yet. Not until me and Harvey get the rules straightened out.
Rules? In a knife fight? No rules.
What? Well, if there ain't gonna be any rules, let's get the fight started. Someone count 1, 2, 3, go.
1, 2, 3, go.
Various combinations of the Wild Bunch stepped up their activities in 1897. Sundance, Harvey Logan, and George Curry led an assault on the bank at Belle Fourche, South Dakota. Then in April, Butch and his boyhood friend, Elsie Lay, further enhanced the legend of the outlaws.
Perhaps one of Butch's most famous robberies was the robbery of the Pleasant Valley Coal Company. Butch and this character, Elsie Lay, rode into town about a week ahead. They'd already heard that payrolls came in there pretty regularly. They told everybody around the town that they would be racing their horses up and down the street, and they told people that they were on their way to Salt Lake City and they were going to be in horse races there, and they'd like to get some practice along the way. The payroll came in. A fellow by the name of Patterson was the paymaster. He came down the stairs and went over to the train, got the bags of money, and as he started to walk up the stairs, a sleeping cowboy on the stairs suddenly came to life with a 6-gun in his hand and said, "Drop them bags and raise your hands." And, of course, this is Butch Cassidy. Elsie Lay is right nearby, and they both jump on their horses with the bags. Elsie dropped one, got off the horse, got back on the horse again, and they raced down Canyon.
But while the movie played up an affable, almost bumbling approach to their work, the reality was very different.
One of the things that's very difficult to show in the film is the careful planning that goes into the robberies that they had. They really planned very well. They're really very intelligent.
Butch Cassidy, at least as well as any other person in the West, knew horses. And he's the one who should be credited with developing the high art of relays after robberies. It was he who insisted that horses be placed in distances from the robbery to the capability of horses to run that distance. And he knew about how far a horse could run before it became exhausted, and then there would be fresh horses, and there would be somebody holding the horses there. Well, of course, the poor posse, which is organized back in town, they get out there, they have no relay, so they have no fresh horses to get onto, and by about that time, the posse gives up.
The According to William Goldman's research, the real Butch and Sundance survived not through intimidation, but rather by their charm.
Cassidy was always in trouble, and he was always trying to hide out. He was famous for when the local sheriff was after him, he would ride up to a farmhouse and say, "I'm really in trouble, man. I'm Butch Cassidy. Can you hide me in the basement?" And they would say, "Sure."
Here, room 9, the top of the stairs.
Ironically, it was the portrayal of this same likable charm that would earn the film some of its most vocal criticism.
I remember reviewing it at the time and being not entirely taken by the movie. It felt then just a little too jokey, a little too light.
Hey, you realize you're driving me crazy staring out the window like that?
I think I was still kind of imbued at that time with the kind of classic values of the American Western.
There's a lot of how dare you mess around with this genre. You're violating a whole form. You're shooting a sacred cow because you're screwing around with a Western. And so there's a lot of that.
But the filmmakers would also respect the truth of the real Butch and Sundance's story, that their days were numbered. Original members of the Wild Bunch had fallen by the wayside. Alzaleh was arrested and sentenced to life in prison in October of 1899. In April of 1900, flat-nosed George Curry was shot to death near Green River, Utah by Sheriff William Preece. It was the unspoken promise of a new century that men like Butch and Sundance would be hunted down and killed.
Don't move. Stand up. Put your hands up. Higher. Now turn around and stop.
Get a horse and come on back here. Get out of here. Get out of here. Get out! Go on! Get out of here, you fat-headed beast! Come on! You're the fat-headed beast. Quit shouting! Boy, somebody sure trained him.
George Roy Hill and William Goldman fused a lighthearted comedic tone with true events throughout the film. A prime example was a repeated robbery of the same Union Pacific train.
Reality was, the Bill Gates of his day, E.H. Harriman, ran a huge conglomerate called the Union Pacific Railroad, and Cassidy kept robbing him, and he got angry.
The movie portrayed two robberies of Harriman's Pacific Flyer happening one day apart. In fact, they were separated by 14 months. While his scenes were played mostly for laughs, the movie introduced us to Charles Woodcock, another historically based character. Woodcock had the misfortune of witnessing both train robberies Butch and Sundance committed together.
Okay, open up in there. I work for Mr. E.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific Railroad.
Hey, Woodcock!
Butch?
You okay?
Well, sort of. Hey, that's wonderful. Let's take a look at you. Well, now, Butch, you gotta have more respect for me than to think that I'd ever fall for a stunt like that.
In real life, they robbed a train twice that had a guy named Woodcock who was guarding the safe. And the second time, he wouldn't open it.
Woodcock, what'd you have to go and do something like that for?
Well, Butch, you blew the last one so easy, I just had to, do something.
Give me that and get some more. A lot more. Well, that ought to do it.
Think you used enough dynamite there, Butch?
Frustrated by Butch and Sundance's repeated holdups of his trains, E.H. Harriman hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency. brothers William and Robert Pinkerton organized a band of lawmen to end the reign of terror.
Now, the Pinkertons had somewhat of a role in pursuing the Wild Bunch, but the thing that the Pinkertons will never tell you is they never caught an outlaw.
The Pinkertons assigned agents to try and infiltrate the gangs. The most well-known of them was Charlie Siringo, who claimed in later life to be the first undercover cowboy. Siringo infiltrated and rode with the reputed gangs for weeks in an attempt to establish identities and potential crimes.
They spent a lot of time chasing them. Siringo spent all of one summer going clear from northern Colorado and Utah, clear down into New Mexico, down to the bottom part of New Mexico, and he never caught any of them. The Pinkertons had several top operatives in the field against the Wild Bunch at various times, and they never caught one of them.
The second part of the Pinkerton plan, funded by Harriman, was unprecedented. A so-called super posse was formed, and a special train was outfitted to transport the detectives and their horses. The first appearance of the infamous super posse was vividly captured in the film.
What the hell is that?
First of all, I'm a dramatist. As a cinematographer, I write with a visual language. The ominous presence of that train is a total mystery to them. It's the introduction of the posse. And so you need to dramatize that. In writing, you can say they're hidden in this car and all of that kind of thing, but Butch and Sundance don't know what's in that car. But they know there's something mysterious about just a single car coming along and stopping near them. I just built a ramp so that when the door opened, we would have this sudden, huge burst of energy coming from the horses, which was a dramatic license. They came out of there, and I don't know how they came out, whether they were behind a hill in reality, and it doesn't matter. The important thing is that, like, we dramatized it so that it became a very important moment, which focused their realization that they'd better get on the lam.
Whatever they're selling, I don't want it.
The train stops and out leaps this posse, and they are implacable. They are distinctly the forces of modernism in this movie.
Having gotten away with $30,000, Butch and Sundance were pursued by 2 sheriffs and 40 volunteers for over 500 miles. Yeah! In the film, Goldman replaced these local lawmen with the renowned super posse in what became the film's 27-minute chase sequence.
Split up! How many of them are following us? All of them. All of them? What's the matter with those guys? Yeah!
George wanted to keep the super posse at a distance, and I found the techniques to do that with using a long lens and having their presence close to us because I have a telephoto lens on, but because they're so far away, you also have the sense of distance and the facelessness of a irresistible force against an immovable object.
Jesus, who are those guys?
The reality was Cassidy heard that they were coming after him, and he fled to South America immediately because he knew they'd kill him. Well, I didn't know much, but Westerns are based on confrontations. So what I made up was not the super posse, but the super posse chase.
Goldman's dramatic device worked as the audience forgave Butch and Sundance for running away.
How long before you figure they're not after us?
A while longer.
How come you're so talkative?
It's naturally blabby, I guess.
I haven't done so much riding since I quit wrestling. That's a miserable occupation. Dusk to dawn, no sleep, rotten food. Hey?
I see it.
torches, you think?
Maybe. Maybe Leonard.
Fell on our path.
Dead on it.
I couldn't do that. Could you do that? How can they do that? Who are those guys?
In reality, after their final train robbery, Butch and Sundance actually used a train to travel several hundred miles to commit a bank holdup in Winnemucca, Nevada, barely 2 weeks later.
Some years ago, I found a man in Winnemucca, Nevada by the name of Lee Case. He was 92 years old, and someone told me that he knew something about the Winnemucca robbery. So I went to see Lee and interviewed him, and Lee said they came in and hung around the livery stable during the day. When the kids would get out of school in the afternoon, which was right near the livery stable, they would go down and the outlaws would come out and talk to them. And they were very friendly, and they'd ask them questions about the town. And one of them asked Lee Case's buddy, Vic Button, what's the easiest way to get out of this area if you wanted to go to get out of this entire valley? Well, you take Soldier Pass. You go down across the bridge, you're right out to the east, and then you take Soldier Pass through the mountains, and that gets you out of the area. And inadvertently, the young man is giving this escape route to the outlaws.
The story survives that the gang was staying at the CS Ranch and that Butch was riding a white horse.
And Vic Button said, I'd sure like to have a white horse like that someday. And so on the day of the robbery, where they have their first horse relay set up, they jumped off the horses. The posse now is not very far behind, and Butch Cassidy said, give the horse to the kid at the CS Ranch, the white horse. And they got on and rode away. Lee Case told me, yes, they gave the horse to Vic Button, and he had the horse for years.
Before long, the two gunslingers would be joined by a mysterious companion named Etta Place, a woman who has both intrigued and baffled historians to this day.
Keep going, teacher lady. Let down your hair.
Do you know what I wish?
What?
That once you'd get here on time.
While the lives of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid have been thoroughly documented, the true identity of Sundance's girlfriend, Etta Place, remains largely a mystery. Even her name is in doubt. Some accounts refer to her as Ethel.
Elusive Ethel. She is a total unknown. She probably came from Texas. We know that because the Pinkertons say that they saw her or records of her in Texas.
Sundance's mother's maiden name was Place, and Ethel adopted the name as an alias.
No one knows Ethel Place's real last name, so you have nowhere to start. Census records, church records, death records, anything like that. You've got nowhere to start.
Although no one knows her true identity, William Goldman chose to have us remember Etta as a school teacher.
The books at that time said she was a prostitute, but she was so pretty, and the life that prostitutes led was so hard. I didn't believe for a minute she could have been a hooker and be that gorgeous at the age of 30 or whatever she was. So I figured she had to be a teacher.
I would like to think that Ethel was not a prostitute. She may very well have been. The guys probably met more prostitutes than they met nice ranchers' daughters.
The theory that Ethel may have been a rancher's daughter has been embraced by Sundance's descendants.
We kind of assumed that maybe she was a rancher's daughter down in Texas. And during the off-season, when there wasn't any cattle ranching being done up north in Wyoming, Montana, these guys from the Wild Bunch would find their way south to Texas from maybe November to the following March. And so we assumed that maybe she was a rancher's daughter that Sundance had met when he was working for a rancher down there. And then after maybe coming back for a couple of years, they became pretty close. And then when Sundance said, hey, the heat's on, the Pinkertons are getting close to me, I got to leave the country, she decided to marry him and to go with him and to be husband and wife.
For Catherine Ross, the role of Etta Place presented the challenge of how to walk the line of an untraditional relationship.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting about my part is that the closest thing I had to a love scene was not with the person that I was supposedly in love with, which was, you know, the bicycle ride, and that whole aftermath was all with Butch.
Raindrops keep falling on my head, and just like the guy whose feet are too big for his bed, nothing seems to fit. Those raindrops are falling on my head, they keep falling. So I just did me some talking to the sun, and I said I didn't like the way he got things done, sleeping on the job. Those raindrops are falling on my head, they keep falling, because I'm free, nothing's worrying me.
Butch, do you ever wonder if I'd met you first, we'd been the ones to get involved?
Well, we are involved, Ella, don't you know that? I mean, you are riding on my bicycle. In some Arabian countries, that's the same as being married.
Hey. What are you doing?
Stealing your woman?
There's never really a love scene with Sundance and I.
Take her. Take her.
I thought that was interesting.
What is known is that Etta met Butch and Sundance in Fort Worth in November of 1900, much later than the movie suggests. The Outlaws had traveled to Texas to attend a wedding of a fellow gang member. On the same trip to Fort Worth, where they met Etta, Butch, Sundance, and 3 other gang members made a costly mistake. Donning bowler hats, they posed for a group photo in the studio of photographer John Swartz,
which it turns out was not one of their smarter moves. Pinkerton Detective Agency got a hold of this Fort Worth 5 portrait and was able to make wanted posters with their pictures on it.
The Pinkertons plastered the West with these wanted posters, so Butch, Sundance, and Etta fled east. Their journey would become one of the most unusual and mysterious odysseys in Western outlaw history. The filmmakers illustrated the trio's escape to New York City by using a photo montage.
One of the things that is extremely well done in this film is the whole venture into New York City. Just to see these people, to see Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, now they're dressed up in their finery with this lovely young lady named Etta Place, and they actually did come to New York. They came to New York on February 1st, 1901, and they spent about 3 weeks here. They put time in the tours. They went to Tiffany's. The old center of New York at that time was down around Union Square. I was fortunate enough to be able to go through some of the Pinkerton files, which I don't think had been released before at that point, and finding little bits of notes that the agents had written on and so forth, found where they had their first meal, and on their first night in town they had a champagne supper, which at a restaurant called the Abbey Tavern, which was 7 owners ago. They really had quite a time in New York City.
I think that the musical sequences worked particularly well in this film because George Roy Hill came from a musical background, and I think music played a huge role in his life.
This photograph of Etta Place was taken at the Young Studio. She posed with Sundance in what many regard as their wedding picture, although no marriage certificate has ever been found. Certainly DeYoung had a lofty opinion of the couple.
DeYoung had commented to somebody later on, I think maybe when the pictures were finally picked up by the Pinkertons, that he thought it was a young minister and his wife.
On February 20th, 1901, the trio set sail from Pier 32 near the Brooklyn Bridge, destined for South America.
One of the things I'd love to know, if Cassidy were alive, you want to say, why South America? Why do you want to go to Bolivia? He's not from a Bolivian background. Why would he want to go to a place like that? I don't know. And was it Fitzgerald who said there are no second acts in American life? Well, they had one.
Well, you know, it could be worse. You get a lot more for your money in Bolivia. I checked on it.
What could they have here that you could possibly want to buy?
Geez, all Bolivia can't look like this.
How do you know? This might be the garden spot of the whole country. People may travel hundreds of miles just to get to this spot where we're standing now. This might be the Atlantic City, New Jersey of all Bolivia, for all you know.
Look, I know a lot more about Bolivia than you know about Atlantic City, New Jersey. I can tell you that.
Aha! You do, huh? I was born there. I was born in New Jersey. Brought up there. So...
You're from the East? I didn't know that.
The total tonnage of what you don't know is enough to shatter.
I'm not sure we're accomplishing as much as we might here.
Listen. Your job is to back me up because you'd starve without me. And your job is to shut up.
Well, he'll feel a lot better after he's robbed a couple of banks.
In the film, Butch and Sundance go directly to Bolivia to continue their life of crime. But recent revelations have shown this wasn't the case.
The major difference between what actually happened to Butch and Sundance and what is depicted in the movie is that they went, instead of to Bolivia, they went to Argentina. And they went to Argentina not to pursue a life of crime, but to start a ranch and live there the rest of their lives, raise cattle, sheep, horses. Argentina might seem to some a curious choice for Butch and Sundance, but at the time was a mecca for immigrants from Europe, to a lesser extent the United States and Canada, but people from the U.S. were going down there. When Butch, Sundance, and Ethel got off the ship in Buenos Aires in early 1901, they probably thought they were back in New York.
The trio settled into the Hotel Europa, made a large deposit in the Banco de Londres, and soon met a land speculator named George Newberry. He apparently convinced them to take a look at the Patagonian area of Argentina, several hundred miles from Buenos Aires.
The part of northern Patagonia where they settled, in the valley of Cholula, where they established their ranch, was very much like the Rockies that they came out of. And at one point, Butch writes a letter home to a friend praising the area and talking about how beautiful it is and how good it is for cattle. They were in a valley populated by other immigrants from Texas and Wales and England, and so they could speak English with a lot of their neighbors, trade cattle, go to fiestas, and I think that it was a much more domestic life there than they had ever had before in the United States, where they bounced around from place to place, part of it because they were being chased. And part of it was that they had small ranches in Wyoming that didn't really amount to much. Whereas in Argentina, they petitioned the government for public land, and they had a pretty nice ranch.
These rare photographs capture Butch, his neighbors, Sundance, and Etta in front of their cabin. They offer a glimpse back through time and suggest that they were trying to write a happy ending to their story.
Butch and Sundance's ranch in Patagonia is much more evocative because it's there, and you knew they lived there, and it actually looks like a cabin in the Rocky Mountains.
The cabin still stands today, where the fugitives lived peacefully for over 4 years under the aliases of Jim Ryan and Mr. and Mrs. Harry Place.
The descendants of her neighbors still talk today about what a good housekeeper she was and how she put perfume in the water basins that they used instead of when they didn't have running water. And that place was very nicely decorated. They had brass lamps and wainscoting and wallpaper.
In an ironic twist, the former rustlers even registered their cattle brands with the government. Unfortunately, Butch and Sundance's dream was short-lived. The determined Pinkertons never gave up the chase. They sent an agent named Frank DeMaio to pick up their trail.
In South America, the Pinkertons traced them, sent a detective down to find out where they were living, and ultimately led to their being chased out by supplying the Argentine police with their pictures, including a warning that if there's ever any crime, like the holdup of a bank or a train in that part of the country, you can be sure Butch and Sundance did it.
But in a case of bitter irony, Butch, Sundance, and Etta would soon lose everything over a crime they didn't commit. In the movie, Butch and Sundance believed they were followed to South America by members of the Super Posse. In reality, Argentine police were told by Pinkerton agent Frank DeMaio that if there was a robbery, Butch and Sundance would probably be the culprits. In the spring of 1905, 700 miles to the south, two gringos held up a bank at Rio Gallegos in Argentina. Because of DeMaio's warning, Butch and Sundance were unjustly accused of the crime.
Several witnesses say they weren't down there. There are other documents that say they were at their ranch.
Now with a warrant out for their arrest, Butch, Sundance, and Etta hastily sold their ranch and fled into neighboring Chile. With no other means of survival available, they returned to a life of crime.
Esto es un robo. Manos, Manos arriba.
They got him up. Skip on down.
Arriba.
Skip on down.
Todos ustedes arismense a la pared.
They're against the wall already.
Donde es? Ah, you're so damn smart, you read it.
Unknowingly, screenwriter William Goldman recreated history when he depicted Etta joining Butch and Sundance in a South American robbery. Years after the film's release, new evidence indicated that she did, in fact, help rob a bank in the town of Villa Mercedes.
As far as anyone knows, Ethel Place was never involved in any crimes in the United States, and none in South Her until Villa Mercedes. But she was identified. People said there was a woman involved. There were 4 people, 3 men, 1 woman, and her picture was pointed out by some eyewitnesses. She rode with them. She handled a gun. She was a full participant in the holdup, although strangely, soon thereafter, she went back to the United States. Maybe she needed money to get home.
that a pretty sight?
Soon after the robbery, just as in the movie, the real Etta did return to America, where she disappeared without a trace.
I might go back ahead of you.
You mean home?
Hey. Etta's thinking of maybe going home ahead of us.
Whatever she wants.
I'll go then.
Etta in the movie is set up almost as the smartest one. I mean, that is to say, she is the one who, more than the two guys, have a sense that there's real danger out there, that they will probably come to a bad end.
Many people believe that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid spent their final days in South America running from the law. But the details of their last moments are shrouded in mystery.
Can you hit anything?
Sometimes.
Hit that. No, son, I just want to know, can you shoot your piece again? And shoot.
Can I move?
Move? What the hell you mean move?
I'm better when I move.
Yeah. Well, considering that I'm desperate and you are just what I'm looking for, on top of which you stem from the U.S. of A., we start tomorrow morning.
You mean we got jobs?
Payroll guard.
In both the film and reality, Butch and Sundance unsuccessfully tried to go straight. After Etta's departure, they found work in a mining company in South America.
The high mountains with her lover.
The character of Percy Garris, played by Strother Martin, was based on a real mining superintendent named Percy Siebert.
Siebert was the sub-administrator. He had some sort of managerial capacity, and he became friends with them and found out that they were outlaws from the United States. But nonetheless, they were friends, and Butch and Sundance, even in the U.S. and certainly in South America, never committed crimes within their own little community or among their friends or where they were working, and that certainly was the case in Bolivia.
Of course, you probably think I'm crazy, but I'm not. Bingo. I'm colorful. That's what happens when you live 10 years alone in Bolivia. You get colorful.
Siebert wasn't killed, as he was in the movie, but retired to the United States and became a key source of stories about the final days of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
It's unclear whether he exaggerated and these stories were then picked up by writers in the U.S., or he told certain stories which were then exaggerated by the writers.
Siebert recalled that after Butch and Sundance failed to go straight as payroll guards, they returned to their outlaw ways.
Towards the end of Butch and Sundance's couple of years in Bolivia, they go to Santa Cruz in the eastern lowlands. And a letter survived from that visit where Butch is writing back to their friends in the mining camp where they'd been working. And he talks wistfully about wanting to turn back the years and relive his life again, and mentions looking for another ranch to buy in the area around Santa Cruz. And that may be what led up to their one and final fatal holdup in Bolivia. They'd gone to a town in southern Bolivia to rob the bank. But while they were in the town, a group of soldiers showed up, so they changed their plans and decided to go after a mining payroll. And one can speculate that, therefore, this holdup wasn't quite so well planned.
I tell you, no more jungle work for me. You're getting to be an old maid. Keep your old maid remarks to yourself if you don't mind. What is it?
I don't know. San Vicente.
Comer?
Sí, señor. Pasen. Juan, ven, llévate los caballos.
In the film, the outlaws rode into the tropical village of San Vicente following the robbery. The real San Vicente was located in a barren and desolate region 15,000 feet high in the Andes Mountains.
It's high, around 15,000 feet. It's cold. It's above the tree line. If you're traveling in that part of Bolivia, and you're traveling on mules, that was the mode of transportation, you have to go into a village like this for fodder for your mules and for a place to sleep. No one slept outside. You don't do that. And there's nowhere to feed your animals. So they were forced into San Vicente. Normally people would have a spare room somewhere, and that's, in fact, what happened. They were led to a spare room, and their mules were taken to be fed, and they ordered their last supper, which turned out to be sardines and beer.
The specialty of the house, and it's still moving.
During the film's climax, Butch and Sundance made a brave stand against both a large police force and an army patrol that was tracking them.
What moves me most on earth is stupid courage. I don't know that I knew it consciously, but I knew once I had the idea that they wouldn't talk about the fact that they were dying, that they'd bitch at each other like they have been throughout the movie, I knew I had for me a moment of stupid courage.
I got a great idea where we should go next. I don't want to hear it. Change your mind when I tell you.
Shut up.
Okay.
It's your great ideas that got us here.
Forget about it.
I don't ever want to hear another one of your ideas, all right?
All right.
I had to have something to give me confidence to write. And what gave me confidence was the sequence at the end. And that's still as good a scene as I can write.
You didn't see LaFours out there, did you?
LaFours? No.
Oh, good. For a moment there, I thought we were in trouble.
Although the filmmakers chose not to show the actual deaths of Butch and Sundance, the ending left little doubt that the outlaws met a grisly fate. But a far different and perhaps darker picture of what really happened in San Vicente has recently been brought to light by historical research.
A small patrol of 3 soldiers and 1 policeman came south to San Vicente, and they arrived at about 3:30 in the afternoon.
When Butch and Sundance came into San Vicente a few hours later, they didn't know that the small patrol had been alerted to their arrival. 2 of the soldiers and the policeman went to investigate.
The policeman and the 2 other soldiers went to the place where Butch and Sundance were lodging, and Butch appeared in the doorway and fired a shot at the lead soldier. The policeman and the remaining soldier began firing in through the doorway of the room they were in. And there was no way out of this room. There were no windows. And so they were trapped.
So it was a rather small shootout lasting maybe only 15 minutes and ending then several hours later in the middle of the night when, as far as everyone can tell, Butch shot Sundance and then shot himself. They were wounded, sick, cold, surrounded, and they just put an end to it.
Many historians are convinced that the outlaws were buried in a small graveyard high in the Andes. But larger-than-life legends die hard, And there are some who maintain that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid lived to write again. In 1991, historians Dan Buck and Ann Meadows wanted to prove once and for all that Butch and Sundance were indeed buried in the cemetery at San Vicente. They organized an expedition to exhume the bodies and use modern science to establish their identity.
The thing that really drove us was that we wanted to know what happened. We just became obsessed with finding out, were they killed or did they come back? And in the beginning, we thought that they had come back, and we hoped that they had come back, but the more we looked into it, the more it seemed that they hadn't survived. For us, the highlight of the whole process was not the digging up of the exhuming of the skeleton in Bolivia. It was finding the documents with the eyewitness testimony to the holdup and the shootout and knowing exactly what took place on those 2 days in November 1908.
Certainly, we've amassed enough evidence to show beyond what we think is beyond a reasonable doubt that Butch and Sundance were in Bolivia, we're in southern Bolivia, we're in the town, we're involved in the holdup, died in the shootout, are buried in San Vicente. It all works towards that conclusion.
But the outlaws finally had the last laugh and prevailed over modern technology. Only one body was found, and the DNA tests were negative.
Well, in the stories of Butch and Sundance's return, which are legion, I think are driven by two separate factors. One, people have a hard time believing that Paul Newman and Robert Redford could have been killed. That's just right in their mind. But second, there's another factor which goes back centuries, which is the myth of the bandit, the bandit's return. The bandit's return represents hope and justice and the victory of the common people. And these stories are much more interesting than they were shot or shot themselves, met this miserable end in a tiny village 15,000 feet in the Andes.
Ultimately, both historians and family members have come to their own personal decisions about the fate of the outlaws.
I think the whole idea of return of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is often a matter of the heart. Lula tells the story of her brother coming back in the 1920s and coming to the house. You believe he really came back from South America?
Oh, I know he did.
Oh, I believe you.
I don't believe. I know.
You know.
Seeing is believing.
Okay. And he came back to visit you here in Circleville?
Yes.
How long ago was that?
Oh. About 1925.
1925. I think it's very difficult to document. I think it's more fun if we can't prove it. I think they came back. Some people think they didn't come back. And I think I respect both views on that.
Another curious piece of evidence which supports the view that the outlaws may have escaped is a letter Butch supposedly wrote to his old boss, mining engineer Percy Seabrook.
If it could ever be proven that that letter was Butch Cassidy's letter, it destroys at least the Butch Cassidy died in South America, because it's dated January of 1909. And of course, the shootout in which they were killed, allegedly, occurred on November 6, 1908 in San Vicente. To me, the handwriting looks very much like Butch Cassidy's, like the other letters. I know it's devastating, but there it is, and we have it.
Butch's letters may raise the question, but one thing is certain. After 1908, the Sundance Kid was never heard from again.
Sundance wrote regularly to his sister Savannah, and shortly before the shootout in 1908, the letters stopped. So I feel strongly that it's like what my grandfather said when I was a kid about that. He had an uncle that was killed in South America, and I think that he knew, and I think that's the facts.
Perhaps fact will never be separated from fiction, but one thing is certain. The film version of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid would not only entertain millions, but also inspire a renewed interest in the true lives of Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Alonzo Longbaugh.
Raindrops keep falling on my head, but that doesn't mean my eyes will soon be turning red. Cry is not for me.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid premiered on September 23, 1969. The movie was hailed as a groundbreaking Western. It was released in an era where young men were being drafted to fight in an unpopular war in Vietnam. And many audience members took from the film resonant themes that reflected the turbulent times.
I remember somebody coming up to me and saying, "Do you know why the movie's such a big hit?" I said, "No, what?" He said, "Because it's really the Vietnam War." Butch and Sundance are the young kids around today, and they're being made to go and fight in this terrible place, and Lyndon Johnson is the super posse, and they're going to come and take them away.
The film eventually grossed $96 million. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid went on to win 4 Academy Awards. Best Screenplay for William Goldman, Best Cinematography for Conrad Hall, and Best Song and Musical Score for Burt Bacharach. But perhaps the film's most extraordinary achievement was that it inspired people to become historians, searching back through time and dusting off the footprints of 2 largely forgotten men.
When the article came out in the National Geographic after the movie had been shown, Redford spelled out the name Longbaugh. That's when we found out there might be a connection, and I set off on the research to find out whether or not Sundance was, in fact, a relative.
The movie came out in 1969. It really made Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid American heroes and American figures. And so doors were open to me because so many people were interested in the subject, and a lot of it had to do with the interest aroused by that film.
I think that if it weren't for the movie, very few people today would have any interest in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They're inextricably linked with the characters that Robert Redford and Paul Newman played. You just gotta love them.
For Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the legend lives on. The film remains a treasured memory for millions of fans, as well as the dedicated band of filmmakers who brought the characters to life.
I think the spirit of Butch and Sundance is what's important in capturing, and I think that's what Bill Goldman did. Certainly I know what George Roy Hill did, and Catherine and Paul and Robert Redford.
I think that this film really captured the romance of the West and the sort of nostalgia of the passing of something, that it was never going to be the same again. I think it's part of what audiences really responded to.
5 years later, it was reissued, and I went and I watched it. And it was like Gilbert and Sullivan. People were saying, "Who are those guys?" along with the actors. It was like a Rocky Horror thing. And I don't know what it was. It touched a lot of people. Who knows? Well, I'm thrilled it did.
I suspect it has something to do with delight, the delight of the filmmakers while they were making it. And that's what the film is really about, is delight. We had a terrific time.
The final thing, aside from enjoying everybody in it, my admiration for George Roy Hill. He was wily and wicked and full of surprises. But beyond that, George had such discipline for the work. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. He was totally prepared. And I learned a lot from that. He really understands the importance of story.
In the end, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid opened a door that allowed historians and family members to reach back through time and rediscover 2 men that time almost forgot. At its core, it was not only a collaboration of dozens of people, each bringing their passion and talent, but an ingenious blend of Hollywood and history.